Hello and welcome to another fun-filled edition of Adam's Music Box, the live stream, coming to you live from the Situation Room. No, I'm just in a room with situations that occur because war has begun, or at least we're led to believe. And while this is a music show, I thought that we'd take this opportunity, never letting a good crisis go to waste, of talking about music's influence on war. Specifically, has music ever stopped a war or changed the course of military policy? Well, I've put that into the, old cranial calculator, and it seems that the answer is no. But nevertheless, music and war have been inseparable. Songs that are jingoistic or patriotic, or songs that are anti war, and not just songs, but symphonies, operas, instrumental pieces, they're very much part of the wartime experience, culturally speaking. Let's look at some songs that might be an appropriate soundtrack to what we're experiencing or witnessing right now. One, you could say, would be Warren Zevon's The Envoy from the album of the same name. It starts off with Warren singing about the troubles in the Middle East in the 1980s, which are somewhat different than the troubles today, but not as different as you would think. You listen to the song, you'll love it. At least I think you'll love it because Warren Zevon was absolutely great. Then there was, of course, the song 80s by Killing Joke, which mentioned in a more oblique way some of the things that went on, including in their video lots of images from the 1979 revolution in Iran, which is something of an antecedent to where we are today. Then, of course, there's a flock of seagulls with their song about Iran, pronounced Iran in their case, Iran so far away. And it is very far away, which begs the question, what is exactly going on? But let's look at an era, at least in the modern pop music era, where anti-war music became a central theme to the pop culture narrative as set by pop music's tone and, more importantly, pop music's lyrics. And I'm referring, of course, to the Vietnam era, where it was obligatory, more or less, for artists to come out with the song protesting the war in Vietnam. Apart from the Ballad of the Green Berets, which was a pro-military song in the 60s, just about everything else in the 60s and early 70s to do with war and militarism in Vietnam was about that. I mean, Stanley Cowell, one of my favorite pianists, even wrote an instrumental about it called Blues for the Viet Cong. I'm sure Nixon may have put him on a list of some sort, but that's as maybe. No need to list all of the songs of that era. Most of you, at least of a certain age, will be familiar with them. But the question is, did those songs impact the war? And I would say that the answer is a resounding no for several reasons. While the Vietnam War was unique compared to most of the military actions the US got involved in subsequently, and that the armed forces were made of conscripts, that had a deep effect on young people that we might not notice as much in subsequent decades, although I would argue that we are noticing it right now. But because of the draft, because of conscription, a lot of young people had a lot to say about the war. It was the young people who were making the music and the young people who were listening to the music, and it definitely struck a chord with them. Of course, policymakers are always older people, people that are almost always too old to be drafted into the armed forces. And because of that, I would argue that music didn't actually have much of an effect on the policy. On public policy discussions and on the media's approach to the war, sure, but not on the policy itself. And there's even quite a lot of evidence to show that the CIA, those guys, they're probably watching right now. Hey, hi everyone, remember to like and subscribe. Maybe you can do that through the back channels also. But there's quite a lot of evidence which demonstrates that in the late 60s, the CIA began actively infiltrating the so called countercultural movement, including music, and they in fact promoted anti war music. Now, why would they do that? Well, because by 1968, certainly the war was not going well by any objective analysis. A lot of people blame McNamara's style of waging an endless war, which didn't really benefit anyone. But nevertheless, the CIA, realizing that anti war sentiment had spread to mainstream middle class suburban USA, they needed to make the faces, in other words, of the anti war movement look like something that wouldn't have exactly been a source of comfort to middle class suburbia. So instead of people like Eugene McCarthy and Robert F. Kennedy, the clean shaven, articulate faces of, let's just say, war skepticism, the CIA was very much interested in promoting long haired, bearded hippie people having a freak out and promoting them as the face of the anti war movement in order to shock and frighten mainstream America of the time from vocally voicing anti war opinions. Johnson himself, Lyndon Johnson, LBJ, one of the villains of all time, if you ask me, withdrew himself from the 68 presidential race. I wouldn't argue because of music. I would argue because of good old fashioned politics. And so you had a choice between Hubert Humphrey and Richard Nixon. Humphrey was someone tainted with Johnson's legacy because he was the VP, and Nixon was, of course, the political comeback kid of the era, having lost the 60 presidential election and having lost a California gubernatorial election in the interim. Nixon continued to prosecute the war, and he continued to increase the use of air power, particularly in places like Laos and Cambodia. And by the time that the war finally wound down and ended in 1975, a lot of the anti-war gusto in the music industry had been replaced by more AOR style rock music that wasn't necessarily as political, or by disco, which was about getting down as opposed to getting out of the war in Vietnam. I would argue, however, that it just takes about 15 to 20 years before the impact of anti war music does take effect. So while the music of the Vietnam War, I would argue, did not change policy or affect elections in such a way that would have ended the war earlier, I would argue that by the 1980s, when the kids of 1967 and 68 were grown men and women, I would argue that at that time, the music did have an effect, because the people who were in their teens at the time then were grown, and they were paying the taxes and voting and running the businesses and having their voices heard on so-called serious outlets. And this, I think, could explain why Ronald Reagan, for all of his military buildup and all of his rhetoric about the USSR, where especially after 1975 with the Helsinki Accords, there was never a realistic possibility that there would be a direct confrontation between America and Russia. But Reagan was very careful not to get himself embroiled into a new Vietnam. It's why, for instance, when things got hot in Beirut, he pulled the Marines out. And this proved to be a popular decision. It was something even referenced on the recent notorious interview between Tucker Carlson and Ted Cruz. You could look at the entirety of the Reagan presidency. There were no long wars. There was a short strike on Libya, which didn't have too much of an effect, but it was good for U.S. morale and, ironically, for Libyan morale. And of course, there was the very short war in Grenada that was relatively, so far as wars go, relatively bloodless. And so I would argue that the kids who are listening to, Tin Soldiers and Nixon's coming and, oh, 1, 2, 3, what are we fighting for? Don't ask me, I don't give a damn. Next stop is Vietnam. When those hippies became the yuppies of the 80s, they might have sold out a lot of their sociological values, as George Carlin said, but I would argue that they retained, as did the country as a whole, a distaste to ever repeat the mistakes of Vietnam. And then came the 1990s with Bill Clinton. Now, Clinton had inherited a military mood that was set by the first war in Iraq, the Gulf War, which was comparatively short and, from the US perspective, relatively bloodless. This helped to get the taste out of the mouths of people who remembered the carnage of Vietnam. But foreboding things were there. Because of that, not many people were paying attention to the fact that Bill Clinton bombed civilians in Serbia to get the world's most famous blowjob out of the headlines. But that's what he did, and people didn't bat an eye. People having had enough space between Vietnam, the catharsis over Vietnam in the 80s, and now the 1990s, they were ready to be prepped to go to a new war. And with the war in Afghanistan in 2001 and the war in Iraq, the war happened. Now, there was music in opposition to the war, particularly the war in Iraq. It wasn't as widespread as the music of the Vietnam era, I would argue, because there was no conscription in 2001 or 2003, but there was anti-war music. Some of it, to be fair, by the old hippies of the Vietnam era, people like John Fogerty, but there was also BYOB by System of a Down, probably the most important rock band of the very late 90s and early 2000s. And there were a lot of anti war protests, and a lot of the music being played at those rallies was all about opposition from young people to the war, opposition to Bush, etc., things like that. Did it change the policy of the government? No, it did not. But now we're over 20 years later, almost the same amount of time from the beginnings, or let's say the escalation of the war in Vietnam to the Reagan era. And in that same period of time, young people today who would have been maybe kids, like young little kids listening to System of a Down that maybe their older brother or cousin was playing, they are now in positions to be online influencers, to be voters, to be business owners, to have serious jobs. And they, the young, on the left and the right, are voicing very strident opinions against a potential war or an actual war, depending on your semantic descriptions of what's going on. They're against a war in Iran. Now, what's really interesting is that we seem to not only, in a way, let's say the cycle has repeated. The anti-war cultural sentiment, which included music from the Iraq era 20 years later, is now influencing public opinion among all but the very old about war in Iran. At the same time, there is an important difference. And this, a lot of it was because of what the CIA did, as I explained. They wanted the anti-war movement of the Vietnam era to look far left and unwashed, where today that's not the case. Today, a lot of, I would argue, maybe some of the most vehement opposition to a potential or actual war in Iran is coming from the young right. And a lot of this is probably because a supposedly right of center President George Bush is famous for prosecuting the wars in the Middle East of his era. Now, what does that mean? It means that young people who are conservative or right wing minded are looking to other influences. They're looking to traditional conservatives like Robert Taft, who very much warned about what would happen in the Cold War if things like Vietnam occurred. You could argue that Taft predicted that kind of thing. They're looking at sort of neo-traditionalists of the post-Cold War era, people like Pat Buchanan, and they're also looking to anti-interventionist conservative libertarians, people like Ron Paul, who's still going strong on his weekly podcast. Most on the left seem also to be opposed to this war. So what we're seeing now really is a divide more between young and old than between left and right. And if the CIA didn't get involved in the protests of the 60s, you could maybe argue that something similar could have potentially happened then. And so, bringing it back to music, I wonder if we're going to hear any music about this current war. I've already heard some AI music, but are we going to hear some original compositions by human musicians that are about what's going on in the Middle East today? And will it affect contemporary policy, or will it take another 20 years for it to actually change policy? One could make an argument that because the internet has sped up communication and sped up the rate at which we perceive public feeling, certainly compared to the 60s, and I would argue even compared to the early 2000s, 2001, 2003. There's a strong, very strong case to be made that maybe for the first time, if the musicians get their act together, they could actually change policy in a direction that young people want. Something very much to consider. By the way, another song from the 80s, I Don't Want to Get Drafted, by Frank Zappa. Definitely check that out. And then there was 19, Paul Hardcastle. So the 80s did have their sort of what I called earlier a kind of catharsis about the failed anti war music of the 1960s. Let's see how that trend might reflect itself today. As always, like, subscribe, and we will see you next time. Take care.